Welcome everybody to lecture 23 of the course. We're now in unit 4 and we have 4 more classes left. So next time we'll be finishing up Beauvoir and Fanon, and then for the last 2 classes of the semester we'll be doing unit 5, Meaning in Life, talking about Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, Nagel's Absurd article, and various other views about the meaning of life. So today the main questions for us, we're finishing up the question related to Sartre on our relationship with others. And that question is, how does or should our relationship to others affect or impact how we think about ourselves? And then the new question of the day related to topic 2. So that's really the first question is related to topic 1, start on 3 types of being and our relationship with others. And we'll go over the results of the class discussion exercise from last time. And then for topic 2, Sartrean radical, the main topic is a debate between Sartre, who defends radical or absolute freedom, and Beauvoir and Fanon, who defend, by contrast, a focus on situated or concrete freedom. And the main question is, what's the overall relationship between these 2 types of freedoms that these different thinkers defend? So let's turn to Sartre, and we couldn't get to this last time, so let's do Sartre's biography today. As I mentioned, even though we've talked about Sartre a bunch of times throughout the semester, we haven't yet looked at his biography, so let me just go through some of the main details with you. So just a reminder, we're now on Unit 4. We finished up an intro to existentialism and talking about existentialist views on morality and values and our relationship to ourselves in terms of these opposing concepts of an alienated relationship to ourselves and an authentic relationship to ourselves. And now we're on to Unit 4, our relationship to other people. And the main issue here will be the issue we introduced today, the contrast, the opposition between radical and situated freedom. And then and that'll be today and next time, and then we'll finish up with Unit 5, Meaning of or in life. Okay, so here's just some biographical details about Sartre. He was born in Paris on June 21st, 1905. He was an only child. His mother, Anne-Marie, was the first cousin of a very famous theologian, missionary, and humanitarian, Albert Schweitzer. Sartre's father sadly died when he was just 15 months old, and after his death, Sartre's mother moved back to her parents' home, where Sartre's stern grandfather helped to raise him in an upper middle class household. He taught him mathematics and introduced him to classical literature. Sartre learned to read at the age of 4, and he read both French and German books, Voltaire, Hugo, Flaubert, etc. He attended the Lycée Henri Quat as a boarder, and at 17, he received his baccalaureate or his high school diploma. In 1924, he entered the École Normale Supérieure and began 6 years study for his agrégation, which was a test one needed to pass in order to pursue an academic teaching career. And there were many other famous people who went to the ENS along contemporaneously with Sartre or at different times, including the famous scientists Louis Pasteur, the philosophers Henri Bergson, Aron, Merleau-Ponty, Aimé Césaire, who we're going to be talking about when we get to Fanon, Simone Weil, Foucault, Bourdieu, Derrida. In 1928, when he was just 23, Sartre failed his agrégation. He came in last place in his class, and during that time, he studied to retake the exam. That's when he met Simone de Beauvoir, his eventual lifelong partner. In 1931, he took a teaching job at the Lycée in Le Havre. Beauvoir took a job at a Lycée in Marseille. He was drafted into World War II and served in a meteorological unit, but he never saw combat, but became a POW in 1940. In 1945, that's the kind of like landmark event that made him famous, or one of them. He gave his famous lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, which we read in the beginning of the semester, and that started the great vogue for existentialism and Sartre's public notoriety. Uh, um, During that, between 1945 and 80, there was an extremely productive period in his life. He was a reigning public intellectual in France, though he eventually came to be eclipsed by many other succeeding movements like structuralism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, etc. And in 1980, he died. So just let me, I'll just point out 3 general facts like I do for each of the thinkers so that you can get to know these thinkers. Um, so just Sartre's physical characteristics. This is a kind of like funny fact to focus on. So he was only 5'3", just which was taller by an inch than his father, and he had strabismus, which is a wandering eye. So if you, I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, if you look at all the pictures, one of his eyes seems to be misaligned. And this was due to an illness that he had when he was 4, and he was frequently bullied as a child because of this. And as I mentioned, there was a Yale philosophy professor, Stephen Darwall, who also has strabismus, and he had it since 3. And I think that Darwall wrote this book on the second person relationships, a second person standpoint, and his condition deeply influenced his interest in how we relate to others. And I think it also influenced, that condition also influenced Sartre's own interest. So this is what Darwall writes about having strabismus. That's been my problem. And you can think that this might apply equally to Sartre. I've had difficulty getting people to recognize that I'm recognizing them because you can't. And I've actually had dinner with Steve Darwall. He's a great guy, but you can't, like, when he looks at you, you can't necessarily tell if he's looking at you, through one of the his eyes. And so it's hard to, it's somewhat confusing when you're talking with someone with that kind of condition. And I suppose that that's led me to wonder, so he's had difficulty getting people to recognize that I'm recognizing them. And I suppose it led me to wonder what exactly is involved in reciprocal recognition and its significance for moral theory. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to conclude Sartre's account of our relationship to others. And Sartre had very specific hours for writing, and he kept these until his vision in his left eye began to go in 1973, which matched the blindness in his right eye. And ultimately, he continued to work with the help of a tape recorder. And then he died in 1980, and that was from lung edema because Sartre was a chain smoker. He was the kind of French stereotype of someone who smokes a lot in cafes, as we mentioned before. And at his funeral on April 19th, 50,000 Parisians flooded the Boulevard Montparnasse, and his ashes are buried in a shared grave with Beauvoir in the Montparnasse Cemetery. General fact number 2, he had an extraordinary literary output, and he talks about this in his biography, Les Mots. It's literally, the biography is entitled The Words. And so he had numerous important philosophical works. For our purposes, writing on emotions, imagination, the nature of the self. His magnum opus, which we've read several excerpts from, is Being and Nothingness. And then we've also read Existentialism as a Humanism. He had a second kind of magnum opus, Critique of Dialectical Reason, which was a defense of Marxism and a shift towards a kind of more situated and concrete freedom that Beauvoir and Fanon talk about. And then we've read many of his famous literary works. We haven't read his most famous novel, Nausea, or his trilogy of The Roads to Freedom. But we have read No Exit, and he published many other plays. And he also did a biography of Gustave Flaubert, a 3-volume biography, as well as, strangely, he collaborated with a screenplay about the life of Freud with American filmmaker John Huston, but his screenplay was too long to be used. Okay, and then lastly, his overall legacy, first as a public intellectual. So Sartre was one of the premier public intellectuals of the 20th century, and he attacked many different social injustices. He attacked, even though he was a Marxist, he attacked Russian communism. He helped to expose the existence of labor camps, and he opposed the Russian invasion of Hungary and Russian anti-Semitism and the execution of Russian dissidents. He was also an anti-colonialist. He opposed French colonial policies and was defending Algeria in its fight to liberate itself from French colonialism. Uh, and due to his siding with the Algerians as opposed to the French in the Algerian War, um, uh, 5,000 army veterans marched down the Champs-Élysées chanting "Kill Sartre." He was very unpopular for his opposing this French attempt to suppress this independence movement in Algeria. And so he even became a target of paramilitary OAS and escaped 2 bomb attacks in the early 60s. And then he also helped to support, there were many student protests about the treatment of students in France at the time. And he got arrested, but he was ultimately pardoned by the French president or prime minister, I can't remember, de Gaulle, who famously said, "You don't arrest Voltaire," talking about that why he justified pardoning Sartre. And he also protested against Vietnam war crimes and participated with that with Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher. And then lastly, his overall legacy as a philosopher, Thomas Flynn, one of his biographers says that he's arguably the best known philosopher of the 20th century, at least among like mainstream culture. He's the most famous self-proclaimed representative of existentialism, obviously, and he dominated French intellectual life along with Beauvoir for several decades after the end of World War II. In 1945, he refused what is the Legion of Honor medal, which is the same as like, I guess, the American equivalent is, what's the American equivalent? It's, shoot, I can't remember. What's it called? The Freedom Medal?
Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Presidential Medal of Freedom. Thanks, Akshat. And then he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, and he was the first person in history to turn it down, and only one of 2. He said that a writer should not be turned into an institution. He actually asked the Nobel Institute to remove his name from the list of nominees and warned that he wouldn't accept the prize. When they gave him the prize, they ignored that, and then when he got the prize, he just turned it down. And over 50,000 Parisians, as I said, attended his funeral. The headline at the time of his death read, "France has lost its conscience." And the fellow Marxist philosopher and one of the founding members of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, said about Sartre, "He may not want to be the world's conscience, but he is." Okay, so where we ended last time, we saw that Sartre identifies 3 very different types of beings. There's physical objects or being in itself, and that we take a kind of third-person relationship to. Then there's being for itself, that's consciousnesses or self-consciousnesses, and that we take a first-person relationship to. But Sartre thinks that our being is qualitatively transformed when we go from just being isolated just by ourselves to interacting with other people. If you remember, this is a picture of No Exit. And that's being for others, which is not just self-consciousness or consciousness, but a meaning of consciousnesses. And instead of a third-person relationship like we have with True Rocks, or first person that we have to our own consciousness, it's a second-person relationship. It's a direct interaction or confrontation with another person. And so let's just talk about the results of the class discussion exercise from last time. And here's one way of thinking about this. So if you remember, what I asked you to think about was, what's our different relationships to these 4 categories of beings or things, to inanimate objects like rocks versus to plants versus to non-human animals like, say, cats or dogs versus to another human being or another person. So physically speaking, how do we relate to rocks or any other kind of inanimate object in our environment? Well, how do you think we should think about, what's a typical way we relate to inanimate objects in our environment? So I'm going to distinguish between like our physical interactions with these things versus our psychological attitudes towards these things. So this is a question for you all. How do we typically relate to inanimate objects in our environment?
We kind of just like take from them. We don't really relate to them. It's just like,
okay. So I think that's going to be especially, related to the psychological attitudes. We see them as just things to use. And then when you just encounter a physical, an inanimate object in your physical environment, what do you typically, how do you typically physically relate to that object? This is sort of maybe an abstract question. Um,
Like we use it for motion, like
okay,
walking
so
on rock, or
yeah, so and that's, I think I'm gonna like incorporate that under the psychological dimension. Um, what I was just trying to get at with the physical is just something like it's something in our environment that we have to deal with or negotiate with in some way. Um, but psychologically, this is what Max and Jake were both pointing out. Um, we typically think rocks don't have interests of their own. If we care about them at all, it's in terms of our interest because they don't have interests, right? Um, what about plants? How do we relate to plants physically? Um, and is there any way we might relate to plants that might be different from relating to rocks, say, in our physical environment?
I think we take
Uh,
care of them sometimes and we
Okay.
give to them.
And so physically, you might think it's just the same. There's this thing we have to negotiate with or deal with in our physical environment, but you also might think like we might respect their space. Like you don't typically trample flowers. You might trample grass, but you know if you saw something like blooming like this, you probably wouldn't want to just like step all over it. But you don't mind stepping over uh, rocks. And then psychologically, we take care of them. And why do we don't typically take care of rocks. People used to have pet rocks, but that's weird. But uh, why do we take care of plants, or why do we have that attitude that we take care of them in a way we don't take care of, say, an inanimate object like a rock? What is it? What's special about plants that makes us think, we want to take care of them in some way?
Are alive maybe, but I
There,
also think that there are certain categories that of like, for example, if you find like a cairn, I think that's the name for it, which is
uh,
a like a set of rocks that have been carefully set up. I
mhm.
think then some people would also have some significant care to it, so maybe
Yeah,
there's something like relational to that aspect. I don't
right.
know.
And so, like, it might be that, like, if you see a rock formation that you think somebody created, you might not want to destroy it but it's not because of the rocks themselves, but because of their
There's some that
relationship to,
happen.
like,
There's some that happen from like nature, like the
yeah,
rock, like the old man on the mountain in New Hampshire, like things like that.
yeah. And even there, you might not think that that the rock formation has its own interest. Rather, it's just that we like beautiful or interesting
Oh yeah,
natural
yeah. Oh
formations
okay,
like
I
that.
see. Yeah.
By contrast, we might think that plants actually do have their own interests, and those are related to life, and that we have this attitude of respecting, that aspect about them. Um, and so psychologically, we might care about plants in a way we don't care about rocks. Does that make sense? Because plants are alive. So when it comes to non-human animals, I think it's going to be similar to 2A. Either it's just something in our environment that we deal with, or that we respect their space. Typically, like you don't just walk on a cat that's sitting on the floor. You like walk around it because you think you have to respect its space in some way. Uh, so I think that's even more apparent in non-human animals and plants. What about psychologically? Um, uh, I think animals also have their own interests, but I think it goes beyond just life. What else is related to the interests of animals that makes them different from plants? It's not just that they're alive, but I think there's a way that um, things like cats and dogs exist that's different from the way plants exist, and that we have an additional aspect of care or layer of care related to plants. Sorry, to non-human animals.
You think,
Ignoring things like ants and stuff like that we don't like, or spiders.
well,
What's
you
our
think,
way of relating to non-human animals.
Like we think that they experience pleasure and pain and maybe emotions or some cognitive abilities.
Yeah, exactly. What they have not only interests related to life, but interests related to sentience, to the ability to feel pain or pleasure. So we don't just care about like them being alive, but we don't want to hurt them either. And so lastly, when it comes to another human being or another person, and so persons could be like, say, aliens or something like that. Physically, I think it's going to be similar to 2A, that they're an object to be negotiated with our environment, but also that we respect their space, and we respect their space even maybe more than we do cats and dogs, or maybe the same as. And then when it comes to their interests, what do you think are the interests of animals, people, and how might those be? So I think that they have interests related to life. I think they also have interests related to pain and pleasure, but I think there's an additional layer of interest that we think we have to take account for when we're interacting with people. Can anyone think what the additional set of interests are? So it's not just that people are alive, or even just that people experience pain and pleasure, because we treat dogs and cats that way. There's a way we treat humans that's even deeper or richer, or at least different than the way we treat things like dogs and cats.
Relationships?
And can you expand more? In what way do our relationships to people, as opposed to say our relationships to our cat or our dog, differ from one another? Because we have relationships to like our pets too, right?
You might argue, or I might argue, that it might be more meaningful or significant.
Mm-hmm. So it seems in some ways more meaningful or significant than the way we relate to a dog or a cat. And why does it seem so more meaningful or significant?
There's more social gravity with people.
Okay. And when you say social gravity, what are you thinking about, or what might we think about when we're thinking about the kind of deeper nature of our social interactions with people than with cats or dogs?
I guess I think about it as people have projects, and we tend to respect those projects, or try to advance them.
Okay, so one has to do with like they have their own set of interests that we're respecting, and it's not just related to pain and pleasure, but to like pursuing their projects. And any other thoughts about what makes our interactions with people seem very different from our interactions with cats and dogs?
But because there's no sense of like a psychological hierarchy, like we see them on our same level.
Okay, so, and because they're at our same level, what is our way of relating to other people that we don't do with cats and dogs? Cats and dogs
Be like
generally, yeah. Go on, sorry.
trying to like understand their mindset at times.
Okay, and so what Sartre focuses on in particular, in addition, in conjunction with all of those things, is what we stand in relation to other people is a kind of mutual recognition relationship. And the most distinctive feature of that, in contrast to things like cats or dogs or plants, we don't stand in mutual recognition relations to these, even though they're conscious or alive, or to rocks, is that we impose on them and they impose upon us various normative judgments or demands that don't exist in any other kinds of relationships. What I or others ought or ought not to be doing. And so let's just look at how Sartre describes this kind of mutual recognition relationship between us and other people. And let's think about the normative demands that this is what Sartre thinks is what's special about being for others in a way that we don't have it towards any of these other things. So before we do that, any thoughts, questions, or comments about our way of relating to all these different things and the similarities and differences in our ways of relating? And what makes it seem special, the way we relate to other people, that dimension is lacking in how we relate to non-human animals, plants, and objects. Any thoughts, questions, comments about any of that? And do people understand that this does seem to be special? There's a special dimension here that's lacking in these others, precisely because they're equal and we can mutually recognize each other. We can impose normative demands and judgments upon them that we don't typically do to others' things. Everyone good on that? Okay, so let's turn to Sartre's two main examples to talk about our relationship to others. And so what's great about Sartre in general is he always gives very concrete examples, very vivid examples to illustrate his philosophical points. And the two main philosophical examples that Sartre discusses are the man on the park bench and the voyeur getting caught looking through the peephole, the keyhole. So let me just describe each of them. So in the man on the park bench example, you're walking alone in a park. You think that you're all by yourself, and you notice things in your environment. They're like in the periphery, but then you notice that what looked like a lump, just this kind of shape in your environment, actually is another person. And so at first you think, you're alone and you're just among other objects, and you're thinking about the person that way. But then you realize, oh, that you're dealing with an actual person. And starts going to explore or investigate what's the nature of the transformation when we go from thinking that the man on the park bench is just like an object along other objects in the park versus when we realize they're a person. And then the second example is the voyeur getting caught. So imagine that you are the voyeur looking through a keyhole, looking to see what's happening in an apartment. But then all of a sudden, in this case, you hear footsteps behind you, and you realize that you're not alone in the hallway. Someone's caught you in the act of voyeurism. And so in this case, what the transformation is that you're entirely focused on your own conscious awareness of what's happening in the bedroom. And then all of a sudden, you're forced to, by hearing these footsteps behind you, you're forced to realize that you're someone caught, someone that another person is looking at and judging. Okay, and so before we begin with Sartre's analysis, I think Sartre analyzes these two cases very differently. What do you think about the cases in general? Any thoughts before we look at Sartre's analysis? And does everyone understand what the two cases are basically involving? Is everyone good on that? Okay, so let's just go to the first case. And what I think Sartre identifies are three transformations in both cases. And let me just explain to you the nature of each of these transformations. And I think what's interesting is that each case goes in the opposite direction. This is similar to like the waiter and the woman at the cafe, which were like the two different types of bad faith. These are the two different types of transformations in terms of, and the two different types of ways we can relate to other people. So when it comes to the man in the park, what the nature of the transformation, the overall transformation is that we previously treated them as a kind of being in itself as just an object along other objects, but now who's become a for itself. So first is the transformation in terms of our viewing of the other. We initially saw the other as a kind of being in itself, just a part of our physical environment. And now we realize, oh, that's another person that we're interacting with. So it's this transformation from a kind of like just physical aspect of your environment, another physical aspect, an aspect of your physical environment to another person. The second transformation is in terms of the world and our way of thinking about the world that we're inhabiting. Can anyone guess what the transformation here is? And so let me just put the initial stage. You're thinking that you're all alone in the park, that it's my space. What happens once you realize there's another person there? What does it get transformed into?
Our space.
It gets transformed into our space or a shared space. It's no longer yours. And then the third transformation is in terms of your own transcendence or your own freedom. In some sense, our interactions with others checks the kind of radical or absolute freedom that Sartre has defended in earlier discussions that we've seen. And in what ways does the other person limit, now that we've realized it's another person we're dealing with, in what ways might that other person somehow fundamentally limit our own freedom? Does anyone have any thoughts, guesses, ideas? You know, like you're alone in the park and then you think you're by yourself and you're just like, there's only the physical environment, but then boom, you realize there's another person there. And what Sartre wants to claim is that just that recognition, in some sense, puts constraints or limits your own freedom in various ways. Can anyone think how that might happen, or what?
Could be like a conceptual freedom, like a limit on conceptual freedom, where.
So I think if you remember, there's two different types of freedom: our practical freedom, and then our theoretical freedom. Our practical freedom in terms of how we respond to things, and our theoretical freedom in terms of how we think about things.
Yeah, and
what I think is what happens is initially we have a kind of total supremacy. We're completely unchecked in terms of how we think about the world. But once another person gets introduced, your transcendence in terms of how you think about things is fundamentally checked or limited in two main ways. And so let me just tell you the two ways that Sartre thinks. One is that part of the world becomes inaccessible to you. And several people mentioned this on Moodle. Sartre famously describes that other person is a kind of drain hole or sinkhole in our environment. Does anyone have any clues what that metaphor might mean? They're a drain hole.
Like
or
when there's a
sinkhole.
drain hole, the water flows.
Yeah, the water like
into
goes
the hole.
Towards them. Yeah.
Yeah, so the world becomes relational to that person as well.
Right, exactly. So the idea is that now, as opposed to the world belonging only to me, the world in some sense rushes off to them in the sense that now they're relating to it, and it's not just my relating. So now like that our environment now is not just related to me, but moves or shifts to them. But it shifts to them in the kind of way in which their own understanding of the world is in some sense fundamentally inaccessible to me. I can never climb into their own minds to know how they're engaging with the world, and as opposed to how I'm engaging. And that leads to the second main way my freedom is transcendence. I can't just interpret things in my own way anymore. Once I realize another person is there, now my own interpretations of things isn't supreme. I can't, for example, just see it as my space anymore. It's our space. Automatically, just by their presence, my interpretation is forced to change. You can think about, like, this happens to me often. I like to take walks in Northampton, and then all of a sudden I see that like someone is near me, and now it's no longer my space anymore. And I can't even think of it that way because I have to like deal with this other person. And so I try to like walk quickly to get away from them, and so I can return to my own. But once I realize their presence in their presence, my freedom has been fundamentally limited or checked according to Sartre. Does that make sense, everybody? So let me go to the second example, and then you'll see how it goes in the opposite direction. And then we can just talk about the two examples and what you think about Sartre's analysis of our way of relating to another person. So in this other, the second example is a very different one in many ways, even though it's similar in many ways. So what happens in the second example is, imagine that you're the voyeur. When you're looking in the peephole, Sartre thinks that you're kind of pure for itself. And then now, like, someone catches you looking through the peephole who's become an in itself. what do you think Sartre might mean by saying that you are primarily, when you're looking through the peephole, a kind of for itself, and that somehow you then get transformed into an in itself? And so remember, that's kind of like, that's the opposite direction from the park man on the park bench, which was an in itself, a part of our physical environment, who became a for itself. In this case, we're a for itself who now becomes a kind of in itself, or our in itself aspect is highlighted or emphasized. Can anyone guess or suggest what do you think Sartre's thinking when he thinks that initially we were primarily a kind of for itself when we were just looking through the peephole, all by ourselves, but now we become a kind of in itself once we get caught in the act by another person? Can anyone guess what why Sartre might think that? Or let's just talk about the first, and you can talk about the first stage or the second stage, but maybe just focusing on the first stage. Why does Sartre think that in the first stage we're primarily a for itself? Like, think about you as a voyeur just looking through a peephole. Why are you primarily, like, why is your for itself aspect of yourself primarily emphasized in that context?
Because you're trying to get information that benefits you and may hurt someone else, I guess.
Okay, so and does anyone want to add to that? So in some sense, you're just engaged in your own projects. And does anyone want to add to why your for itself aspect of you is? So what is a for itself again? What's a being for itself? What's the nature of, what's a definition or the main example of being for itself?
Any sort of consciousness.
That's our consciousness. And so the idea here is when you're just looking through the peephole, you're just alone in your own consciousness. You're not aware of anything else that's going around happening to you. You're just like, you're just completely absorbed in your looking through the peephole. That makes sense to people? But then you get taken out of your consciousness. And what do you think it might mean to say now your in itself aspect of your nature is now emphasized? What's the in itself aspect of your nature in general? Like, there's a sense in which, in itself there are things like rocks or inkwells, but there's a dimension of our own human nature that's a kind of in itself. What is that? It's our
bodies.
Our physical body. And so the idea is you're a kind of pure consciousness, and then once you're caught in the act, you realize very strongly your physical body because you've been caught in the act. The other person is seeing you as this kind of person, embodied person looking through the peephole. So now, the fact that this person has caught you, what they've caught, what they obviously are interacting with is not your consciousness directly. They see you in the physical act of being a voyeur. They see your body in the physical act of being a voyeur. So whereas before you were in a kind of pure consciousness state, thinking of, looking through the peephole, now you're very aware of your own body. And this is related to Sartre's discussion of like our experience of shame in the eyes of the other. We want to hide, and hiding is precisely like trying to physically get away from the situation. But in this case, you can't hide, and so your physical, your physical nature is just caught in the act. Does that make sense? So then the transformation is going to be a very similar transformation. It becomes from my space to our space or a shared space. But then lastly now, how do you think our freedom gets transformed in this situation? And it's going to be similar to last time, but I think slightly different. Again, before we had a kind of total supremacy in terms of how we interpret ourselves and our situation. In what way now is our freedom in terms of interpreting ourselves and understanding our situation now fundamentally limited by another person catching us in the act of being a voyeur. What do you think? In what way is your freedom to interpret your own self fundamentally limited or constrained once you are in the situation where, for instance, somebody has caught you in the act of voyeurism? Can you think about yourself in the same way, or is there a sense in which a certain kind of interpretation of yourself is forced upon you even without your own consent?
Yeah, maybe the first question to pop into your head would be, what does this person think about me? So it's no longer your view of yourself. You're wondering what their view of you is.
Right, exactly. And then does anyone want to add to that? So, and so let me just say, so the two main ways I think in which your freedom or transcendence is now checked is this is something that we saw in No Exit. You're now subject to the gaze of the other. You're no longer free to just um, do whatever you please. In some sense now, you're the object of another person's gaze. That was a very big theme in No Exit. And second, that your total supremacy is overthrown in terms of, and this is what Zach was pointing out, your view of interpretation of yourself. In particular, you now recognize you're subject to the norms and judgments of the other person and their negative judgment of you being a voyeur. So I should have done this. I didn't do this. I should have put the two things side by side in a slide. I'll do that next time. But what do you think about these two cases in general? And what do you think about the claim, so the man in the park bench versus the voyeur? Any general thoughts, questions, comments about Sartre's analysis of our being for others? And so the main point of our being for others is our being is itself qualitatively transformed. And one thing that's most radical is that our kind of absolute or radical freedom is now fundamentally limited by the other person. Either because in the previous case, that person becomes inaccessible to you, you can't climb into their heads, and now it's no longer your view of interpretation of things that reigns supreme. Now you have to share it with others, and you can't just think about things any way that you want, the environment any way that you want. In this case, it's slightly different, is that you can't think about yourself in any way that you want. Once you're interacting with another person, now you have to, in some sense, respond to the normative claims that they're making upon you. So a Harvard philosopher, Kristen Korsgaard, she uses this kind of funny example. Like, imagine that you're walking down the hallway. Imagine, this is like pre-pandemic times. So imagine like Akshan. I'm going to use Akshan as an example because he's on the top of my participants list. Akshan's walking down the hallway, and you're just, Akshan's all alone, and then he hears someone call his name, or like I hear someone call my name, Professor Garcia. And what Korsgaard says is, you, even without your consent, you can't go on the same as before. If you actually heard and understood what they said, they put a demand on you, and now you have to respond to that demand by, for instance, ignoring their request, and like turning around and like just keeping walking, or responding to the request. But in some way, you can't go on the same as before. And it wasn't due to your activity, it was due to them putting this fundamental constraint on you. Does that make sense to people? So what do you think about Sartre's examples in general, about the man on the park bench, and then who now realizes there's another person in their midst, versus the man who thinks he's all alone, the voyeur, who gets caught in the act of voyeurism?
Seems pretty much the same to me, both examples.
Right. So they're very similar in some ways, but um, in the first case, it's how you view another person, and in the second case, it's how you view yourself in relation to another person. Does that make sense, Jake?
But isn't it kind of the same thing in the fact that like when you realize that there's another person there, you start thinking about your like their view of you is in both
Um,
cases?
uh, that could be the case. However, in the case of the park bench, you can imagine that the person's like very far away and they never even notice you. So, you don't even have to think about like how are they thinking about me, because they might not even notice me. You could be like hidden or something like that, and spying on them. But uh, so the main point there is instead not how their viewing of me affects how I think about myself. It's now how does my viewing change from thinking about them as a kind of just aspect of my physical environment to now thinking about them as a person.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, because like um, I'm actually like across from a park now. This is where I am located in Northampton, and I can see people walking, and they can't see me. I can see them through the window. But imagine I didn't think that they were a person. I thought it was just like a figure or shape, and now I see it's a person. So, but they don't. Their view of me doesn't figure in because they can't even see me now. But in this case, it is. So in one case, it's where you think that they're a physical object and now they're a person. You realize they're a person. In this case, it's that you're thinking of yourself as alone, and now you realize you're an object for another person. Any other thoughts or responses to what do you think about Sartre's analysis, and what do you think about his claim that even without your consent, your voluntary consent, your freedom is fundamentally limited once you come into the presence of another person, another being for itself.
I liked it a lot in the I thought about like Walker Percy has a famous essay where he talks about like people's obsessions with trying to find like untouched spaces.
Yeah.
And like the dissatisfaction the tourist has when they go visit like the Grand Canyon, and they like go to this vista and there's like 100 other people also there.
Yeah.
And the like objectively no one, like the view isn't changing, but people feel that the view changes when there's other people there.
Yeah.
And I think Sartre's description of like the like what's the word, sinkhole, or word it, like I can't remember what the word is. Drain hole. I think it matches kind of well with some of the feelings that people have when it comes to that kind of like the disappointment of other people being in the space.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example. That you can imagine that you're like alone on a park, on a trail, and you think that maybe you're the only one who's ever been there, and then you look down and there's like a piece of trash right at your feet, and then you realize like your interpretation is forced to be changed because you realize, oh, this is not just my space; it's like this shared space that other people have been through. And then maybe one other comment before we move on to just summarize Sartre's views about our relationship with others.
At the same time, what we were just talking about could also be a positive thing. Like if you're at like a sporting event or something, your shared consciousness is like a benefit in that case, because like if you're watching a sporting event by yourself, like in an empty arena, it's not like the ideal thing. The ideal thing is like the shared consciousness watching it.
And so, Sartre's examples often focus on the negative, but he also recognizes the positive dimensions of our interactions with others too. That this creates certain possibilities for us that couldn't exist otherwise. So turning exactly to that point. But before we do that, so as I said, Sartre often focuses on the negative aspects, and there's this theme of conflict that pervades Sartre's philosophy. So we saw in No Exit, Sartre saying, hell is other people. And this is Sartre distinguishing himself from Heidegger. He talks about in Being Nothingness, it's useless for human reality to get out of this dilemma one must either transcend the other or allow the other to transcend them. And that the essence of relationships between consciousnesses is not Mitsein or being with others. That's Heidegger's account. We didn't read Heidegger's account because we had to cut it out for sake of time. It's not Mitsein or being with others in this kind of harmonious way, it's conflict. And he was deeply influenced by Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic in the Phenomenology of Spirit. He attended Kojève's lectures talking about that. And we even are in conflict with ourselves. So he talks about how human beings are a kind of useless passion due to our impossible wish to be God. So what he basically means by that, he thinks all human beings are wanting to be God in the sense that we want to be a for itself, that is, a consciousness, but not a totally empty consciousness. We want to be like a full in itself too. And we can't be that ever because of, and that by being an in self, that just means we want to be like fully one thing or another, but we can never be fully one thing or another. God alone might be something that's fully God's self and at the same time a consciousness. Our consciousness makes us never fully complete. And that's, how he talks about why we're this unhappy consciousness. We seek this completion, which never happens. But so this leads us, this is exactly what Jake was talking about, is that our relationship, to the other has two dimensions. There's a positive dimension and a negative dimension. And the positive dimension is a kind of harmony that we can have towards the other. And that just involves a kind of mutual reciprocity. So mutual recognition can be in terms of mutual reciprocity. But then there's a kind of conflict-ridden aspect to our relationship with the other. So when you Google the master-slave dialectic, Hegel's master-slave dialectic, I enjoyed finding this picture coming up in Google Images of like two cats or kittens attacking each other. And that's instead of mutual reciprocity, of mutual striving for recognition. So let's just think about when it comes to our harmonious relationships with others, how do we view ourselves in relationships of mutual reciprocity, in relationships of harmonious mutual reciprocity? How do you view yourself in such a harmonious relationship? As what? What do you think?
As subjects?
As subjects, and then something a bit more than just as subjects, because we also see ourselves as subjects here too.
I guess the only subject?
Or actually, so I think it's actually that we see ourselves as just one subject among others. There's no special privileging of ourselves. And how we view the other in this kind of harmonious mutual reciprocity context is just like us, as having similar interests and demands and expectations that they can impose on us just like we can impose on them.
Sorry, I thought you were talking about the Hegel one.
Oh, yeah. And so now, but instead when we have a more negative relationship, a more conflict-ridden relationship where it's not mutual reciprocity, but mutual striving for recognition, then as Akshan pointed out, how we view ourselves by contrast to just one among others, what do you think instead how we view ourselves here? As what? What would the contrast?
The supreme one?
As the supreme one, as somehow privileged. We prioritize our own self-interest, and how we view the others is there's at least three aspects. They're free. They transcend us and our ability to completely control or dictate what they do. Second, as making demands on our freedom, as normatively judging and obligating us, and we do the same with them. So we intersubjectively make demands on each other, and as competing with us based on their own interests. Okay, so we're done with Sartre now. There are just a few discussion questions. So I'll just go through these and maybe have one or two or three responses, and then we'll move on to introducing the last topic of Unit 4, the Beauvoir, Fanon versus Sartre debate. So here are just some questions you can ask yourself. One, do you agree with Sartre that we can't derive being for others from just being in itself or being for itself? So Sartre thinks that if you were just a consciousness alone, like on a desert island, you could never achieve this kind of being for others, and that this kind of being is qualitatively different, and it requires for its realization other people, that even through a pure act of imagination you could never really achieve this kind of understanding. So this is Sartre's claim that you can never feel shame all by yourself. Like on a desert island, you might feel like frustration or regret about what you've done, but you can never feel shame or embarrassment. That requires the actual presence of another person. And if you've never interacted with another person, you can never know the experience of shame or embarrassment. And then second, let's just talk about this. So this was just, does our relationship with another being for itself, is it qualitatively different from like relating to objects? And so Martin Buber, a famous Jewish theologian and existentialist, talks about the I-thou relationship. That's our second person relationship with another consciousness versus an I-it relationship with physical aspects of our environment. And third and lastly, our interactions with other consciousnesses, and this is the one I kind of want to focus on, insofar as they're free and can choose their own responses, and insofar as they have their own self-interest, and that we're all striving for mutual recognition, are our interactions with others, do you agree with Sartre that they're inevitably conflict-ridden? And can we ever outgrow this tendency? What do people think about this? Either of these two questions. Do you think that you could ever know shame and embarrassment if you grew up alone on a desert island? Or is that just a certain kind of experience that's only possible if you gain this new type of being for others? And then the third question was, do you think that given this is a way that we have freedom and our own self-interest and we strive for mutual recognition, that conflict is inevitable? Or do you think we could ever outgrow that tendency?
I had a quick question about Sartre's thoughts on the third question, I guess.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned like in the beginning of the semester that he like eventually would just decided to claim that he was just like a Marxist. And the final claim seems like kind of counter, not to a lot of, but it's not like completely mutually exclusive, but doesn't seem like the kind of humanistic or like total wonderful beautiful class consciousness thing that Marxism would proclaim.
Yeah, except that if you remember Marxism, it does claim that we're fundamentally characterized by this kind of conflict, but there is a kind of more optimistic belief about what happens after the revolution.
Yeah, that's like my question though, like the overriding.
But, I think when Sartre became a Marxist, it was certain aspects, and it was especially the more like structural aspects of Marxism, and we're going to see that when we get to the Beauvoir Fanon debate.
Okay.
So any questions in general, or any thoughts or comments about Sartre's views on our relationship to ourselves? I mean, to other people.
I guess for the first question, it's like, is the mutual recognition innate, or maybe is it like something that's kind of constructed by us? So like if we grew up in a desert island, could we kind of think that maybe animals have a mutual recognition?
Right. So imagine you don't even have like animals in your environment. Just imagine that you're alone with rocks and trees and plants. Could you ever experience shame or embarrassment, thinking about the way you relate to yourself? Or would that never even come into the picture without an other that's judging you and placing certain expectations on you?
You could feel shame in the eye of God or something like that.
Okay, but like imagine that you don't even realize that there are others, whether they're like human others or even God others, that you've never, you're just a being for itself, purely isolated, and never thinking about another being for itself.
Well, if you have a set of morals, then you can be ashamed of an action that you do if it goes against one of your morals?
Yeah, and so that's a question that you might ask yourself, like on a desert island, would you really feel shame, or would you just feel like, so shame or embarrassment, Sartre thinks is inextricably linked up with like our social interactions, our thinking about how the other is viewing us. It's hard to imagine exactly what would happen on a desert island. Obviously, we've never had that kind of situation, and we don't really know. But what Sartre wants to claim, at least, is you wouldn't necessarily feel shame. You might feel like frustration, and there's even a question about whether you'd have moral codes. Whether you would recognize like moral obligations, or whether it would just be purely like self-interest attitudes that you'd have. So, there's a question, if you've never interacted with another for itself, would you ever think that you have moral obligations in general? If all you have are rocks and trees, etc., around you.
Like, what would the obligations be to? Like,
yeah. And, like...
besides to yourself, potentially.
And would you ever, even in relation to yourself, think I ought to do these things? Or would it just be in terms of self-interested, like I'm trying to get this coconut, I want to survive. Those aren't really moral obligations. Those are just based on self-interest.
I feel like someone could derive morals from nature, though. Like if you like wake up every morning, you see like the sun rising, and if you've never been taught about something like that, like you could develop the belief that the thing that's causing that to happen is another consciousness.
Yeah, but notice if you do that, that's a kind of animism. Then the idea is the only way you could even conceptualize that is by thinking that, like there are consciousnesses like you. But, there's this question, would you even realize that you were a consciousness in such a case? Or do we need a kind of mirror to be able to see ourselves in the way that Inné served as a mirror for Estelle to see herself? Would you even realize that you were a consciousness just by yourself? And that there was such a thing as consciousness. And this is just a kind of like, abstract question that we can't really, thought experiment that we can't really know the actual answers to unless we like play it out. Raise some baby on a desert island all by itself, etc. Maybe just related to question 3, 1 or 2 comments, and then we'll move on to the Beauvoir Fanon versus Sartre debate. Do you think that, given that other consciousnesses are free, have their own self-interest, and that we're all striving for recognition, do you think that conflict is inevitable? Or can we ever overcome our tendency to conflict with one another? And maybe let's just see a show of hands, your virtual hands. How many people think that conflict is inevitable given the way that, other people are like in general? Okay. And so it's looking like a good number. And then if you could lower your hands. And then how many people think that we could somehow overcome this tendency to, and like it could just be, conflict could be removed in general? Okay, so a good number of people, let's hear the people who thought we can, how about the people who thought that conflict is inevitable? Why did you think that? Given if we are creatures with free will and have our own interests and we're all striving for recognition, it's going to be inevitable that we come into conflict with other consciousnesses. 1 or 2 people who voted for that option.
At least me, like the only way that'll ever end is when there's the end of like a scarcity of resources.
Yeah.
But that's about it.
But even there, you might think like.
Oh yeah, even then. But that's like the best hope.
Yeah, yeah. And one other person who thinks that conflict is inevitable, given our freedom, our different interests, and that we're all striving for recognition.
I think the idea of like the other person's mind being a sinkhole might play into that. Like, you know, you can never truly experience what it's like to be them. So that kind of limits your.
So because they escape our freedom in some sense, we can't ever completely control or dominate or, you know, like dictate to them. And so there's this inevitable possibility for conflict, it seems. And then how about for people who think that we can at some point overcome this tendency towards conflict? That's a more hopeful students. What were some thoughts behind voting that way?
I would say it kind of relates to the whole like loving the enemy kind of mindset, which is like where you identify something as in disagreement with you, but you love it for the fact that by knowing its opposite view, you are more sure that your view is correct.
Yeah, so there's a kind of mutuality that you might think can help us overcome conflict if we truly appreciate that mutuality. And then Max, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar and definitely like hopeful thinking, but like I feel like if people all, like got to a point where like everyone's goals were the same and we were able to level with that, then I don't think there would be as much of a need for conflict, but I don't know. It would definitely be.
And I think what Sartre would want to say is because we have this radical freedom, our goals will never be exactly the same. Because that's just the nature of freedom. We're just fundamentally use our freedom in different ways, and they're never constrained, and that will lead to inevitable conflict. But you know, that's at least Sartre's view about why that's inevitable. But you might think we might achieve that state. Okay, so we have 7 minutes left. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to skip this and just introduce the main debate. So this is the central debate of Unit 4, and which is on our existential relationship to others. And the central debate of Unit 4, and it's closely related to what we've been talking about. So Sartre defends, says that we have this radical or absolute or abstract freedom just as human beings as such. And what Beauvoir and Fanon instead focus on is what people sometimes call situated or concrete or meaningful freedom, not just as abstract as human beings as such, but as particular kinds of human beings in particular circumstances. And that in contrast to this, which everybody shares, people's situated freedom might be very different from other people's situated freedom, given their own unique natures and their own unique circumstances. And that what Sartre overlooks is the fact that we're not just these abstract, you know, for itselfs. We're concrete in a way that radically, based on very contingent aspects, that radically changes our freedom. And I'm going to introduce this debate by talking about a different debate in political philosophy, but a very parallel debate. This is one that is related to John Rawls's work. So John Rawls is the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century. Most people regard him as writing the most important book on political philosophy since John Stuart Mill on Liberty. And in John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, he makes this distinction between equal liberties versus the equal worth of liberties. So let me just explain this distinction to you. This is what he writes. The inability to take advantage of one's rights and opportunities as a result of poverty and ignorance and a lack of means generally is sometimes counted among the constraints definitive of liberty. That is, as taking away our liberties if we're in those situations. I shall not, however, say this, but rather I shall think of these things as not taking away our liberty, but just affecting the worth of our liberty. So what is John Rawls getting at with this contrast between our basic liberties themselves versus the worth of such rights or liberties? So let me just give you some examples here and then see if you understand what's being talked about. So here's a basic liberty like freedom of movement, freedom of property, etc. But imagine that even though you had freedom of movement as guaranteed by the Constitution, imagine that there was a constant threat of physical violence so that you didn't even want to leave your homes. Or imagine that you have freedom of property, but there's no police force guaranteeing that your property is going to be secure. Or second, and that's the right to property, like imagine that you have this right to property, but there's no social safety net so that many people can't even have a basic level of subsistence. There's no minimal subsistence level, no healthcare, no education, etc. Or imagine that you have freedom of speech and the freedom to run for political office, but realistically, even though the freedom is guaranteed by the Constitution that everyone can run for office, only the most wealthy or socially elite actually have a chance to get public office. Or lastly, imagine that you have the right to vote, but imagine that social conditions are such that you have to work, most people in society have to work like many hours, such that the polling booth are either inaccessible to them because they have to work during those times, or they're inaccessible due to distance. And so the question is, John Rawls is distinguishing between the basic rights themselves. We can still have these rights, even if the worth of such rights might be affected by the lack of resources. Before I go on, does everybody understand the distinction here? So the rights are just things guaranteed by the Constitution. And so what John Rawls wants to say is, if we lack resources, it's not that we don't have the rights themselves, it's just that the worth of such rights or liberties is affected. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide, and we only have 2 minutes left. And the main controversy, and this is one that a commentator of John Rawls's raises, is Norman Daniels, is it seems that one without two just becomes a kind of worthless abstraction, hollow, or merely formal. So this is the way Daniels puts it. The charge that equal liberty without equal worth of liberty is just a worthless abstraction, or that equality of basic liberty without equality of worth of liberty is something merely formal, a hollow abstraction lacking real application. So the basic point here is that these things, the basic rights as guaranteed by the Constitution, without the basic social and material resources to enjoy those rights, our ability to enjoy them, are completely worthless. Do people understand the point being made?
This is kind of like equality versus equity?
Well, yeah, so it's equality as far as political and legal equality versus socioeconomic quality. And so this is, people sometimes distinguish between first generation rights, which are our political and legal rights, versus second generation rights, which have to do with like more socioeconomic rights. And some people question whether second generation rights are really rights or just wish lists. But you might think they're genuine rights because the only way we can even enjoy these first generation rights is if we have these second generation rights. And so the claim is these without these are just worthless abstractions, hollow, merely formal. And so applied to the debate between Sartre and Beauvoir, and we'll have to just end here, the main question is, imagine that you have Sartrean radical or absolute freedom just by being a human being, you have free will. But imagine that your free will is in the context where you have little to even no situated or concrete or meaningful freedom. due to the particular type of person you are and the particular types of circumstances you find yourself in. And so, I mean, what's telling is Sartre, as a kind of upper middle class white male, really focused on that kind of more abstract freedom, whereas Beauvoir as a woman and Fanon as a Black male focused much more on situated concrete freedom that, like, some people might enjoy and others might not, like minorities, women, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, socioeconomically marginalized or challenged people, etc. And so this is the main question that we'll start with next time. Is Sartrean radical freedom, the type we saw in existentialism as humanism, without the kind of situated or concrete freedom based on, and certain ways of being, certain types of ways we can be as a human being and certain circumstances, is this without that also merely formal, a worthless abstraction, or hollow? And that's what we'll talk about next time. Okay, so reminder, just discussion sections tomorrow, and the final exam paper topics are up. They're due on the May 8th, which is a couple weeks from now, like 3 weeks from now. So you should get going on those. Okay, and you can feel free to ask Matt if you have any questions about that. Have a good weekend, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.